4 hours. Iran gave the world a 4-hour warning. Not a threat buried in a diplomatic cable, not a rumor circulating through intelligence back channels. A public military official announcement. In 4 hours, we are hitting every energy site in the region. And what comes next? America will not be able to absorb. Oil refineries, oil fields, natural gas facilities, LNG plants, oil storage terminals, export ports, tanker terminals, power plants, water plants, every single category of energy infrastructure that keeps the modern world alive. Iran just put all of it on the target list simultaneously. And here's why that 4-hour countdown matters beyond the military dimension. Markets were about to open. Trump understood exactly what Iran's announcement would do to oil prices the moment trading began. So he rushed to a microphone and announced he was going to force the Strait of Hormuz open. Big attack coming. Major operation. America is taking action. The statement wasn't a military briefing. It was a market intervention. A desperate attempt to talk oil prices down before the opening bell by creating the impression that America had the situation under control. It doesn't have the situation under control. If you want to stay ahead of every development as this conflict escalates, subscribe right now and hit the bell so you never miss a critical update. Here's what actually triggered Iran's 4-hour ultimatum. Because this didn't come from nowhere. America struck Iran's oil facilities. And not just struck them. The attack was devastating enough that the air above Iranian oil infrastructure became toxic, literally poisonous. Iranian health authorities issued warnings that the atmosphere in affected areas contains dangerous levels of toxic particles. Residents were told, "The food in your home that isn't sealed, throw it away. Your water filtration system, replace the filters immediately. Old filters are now contaminated. Do not breathe the outdoor air without protection." Think about what that means for a civilian population. Your air is poisoned. Your food storage is compromised. Your water filtration is contaminated. This isn't collateral damage as a side effect of a precision military strike. This is environmental destruction of the kind that affects everything living in its radius, human, animal, agricultural, for months after the attack itself ends. Iran looked at that, looked at the toxic sky above its oil infrastructure, looked at health warnings being issued to its civilian population, and announced, "We will now do the same thing to every energy site in your region. $200 per barrel oil." That's what Iran told America directly. Can you absorb $200 oil? Because that's where this goes the moment we execute the next phase. Iran's message was coldly logical. Our domestic oil is cheap. We supply our own people regardless of global prices. We can sustain $200 oil indefinitely. Can you? Can your economy? Can your voters? The answer, if you look at what $200 oil actually does to the global system, is no. Emphatically, structurally, mathematically, no. At $200 per barrel, jet fuel prices make commercial aviation economically non-viable for most carriers. At $200 per barrel, every product transported by truck, which is essentially everything that moves in a modern economy, doubles or triples in shelf price. At $200 per barrel, heating costs in Europe become unmanageable for working-class households. At $200 per barrel, the agriculture system that feeds 8 billion people, which runs on fuel-dependent machinery, fuel-dependent transportation, and petrochemical-dependent fertilizers, faces input costs that translate directly into food prices that hundreds of millions of people cannot afford. This is not economic disruption. This is economic collapse by a different name. And Iran is holding the trigger. Drop a comment below right now. Do you think any government can stop this before the oil storage runs out? Let us know what you think. Oman, the most quietly diplomatic, most carefully neutral country in the entire Gulf, just publicly stated that American and Israeli actions against Iran are illegal and constitute the worst aggression in the region's modern history. When Oman uses language like that in public, the private conversations happening across every Gulf capital are dramatically more severe. Russia's foreign minister met with Gulf state ambassadors in Moscow this week. The Gulf ambassadors came with a request: pressure Iran to stop attacking us. Russia's response relayed through Iran's foreign minister was a question that landed like a slap. You want us to pressure Iran? Has anyone condemned America for killing over 200 schoolgirls in Iranian strikes? Has anyone brought a resolution against Israel and America, the countries that started this war, the way Bahrain is trying to bring one against Iran? The room had no answer because the answer is no. 9 days into a war started by American and Israeli strikes on Iranian soil, the international diplomatic machinery is moving to condemn the country that was attacked rather than the countries that attacked it. Iran noticed. The 4-hour clock was already running. Trump's plan for Iran, as it currently stands, involves sending Delta Force commandos into Iranian territory to seize 400 kilos of uranium and destroy Iran's remaining oil facilities. Let that sentence exist in the air for a moment. Delta Force into Iran to grab uranium. While Iran has active hypersonic missiles, 31 military command centers operating simultaneously, a population of 90 million people, and a military that has spent 40 years specifically preparing for American ground force incursion scenarios. The same Delta Force that operates in countries with fractured governments, minimal air defense and limited military capacity being discussed as an option against a country that just demonstrated it could destroy half of America's regional Patriot systems in a week, force a carrier group to retreat, eliminate a billion-dollar radar installation, and sustain offensive operations across 6 countries simultaneously while absorbing American and Israeli airstrikes on its own soil. The Delta Force option isn't a military plan. It's what happens when the actual military options have run out and the people in the room are grasping for something that sounds decisive. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, something significant happened that most Western media reported briefly and then moved past. Russia publicly and explicitly sided with Iran's framing of this conflict. Not in a vague "we have concerns" way. Russia's foreign minister, in a direct meeting with Gulf state representatives in Moscow, delivered a message that amounted to this: "You are asking us to pressure the wrong party. The war was started by America and Israel. Iranian civilians are dying. Iranian children are dying. The international community is silent about the aggressor and focused on the response. We are not going to legitimize that framing by pressuring Iran to stop defending itself. This matters strategically beyond the immediate conflict. Russia is one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Any resolution that attempts to impose international pressure on Iran, ceasefire demands, sanctions, military authorization, requires Russian approval. Russia has just signaled clearly that it will not provide that approval. The diplomatic route that Gulf states are hoping will de-escalate the conflict has a locked door in Moscow. China's position is worth examining carefully here too, because Beijing said something in the early days of the Gaza war that seemed at the time to be a sidestep. China refused to directly condemn Israel and instead kept saying the root cause of all of this is America. Remove American support and Israeli military operations become impossible. Address the root cause. The world criticized China for not taking a stronger position. Analysts called it diplomatic fence-sitting. Looking at the current situation with American bases across the Gulf destroyed, American defense systems depleted, American carriers retreated, American credibility shattered, and American domestic opposition at 90%. China's framing looks less like fence-sitting and more like the most accurate strategic analysis anyone offered at the time. America is the variable. Remove it, and the regional equation changes fundamentally. Every other actor, Iran, Israel, Gulf states, Hezbollah, Russia, has a regional logic that can be negotiated around. America's presence converts those regional negotiations into a global confrontation with no ceiling. Now let's talk about the toxic air over Tehran, because this development is being underreported and its implications are severe. When oil infrastructure burns at the scale and intensity of what happened in Iran, it doesn't just destroy the facility. It releases into the atmosphere a cocktail of petrochemical compounds: benzene, hydrogen sulfide, sulfur dioxide, heavy metal particulates that are toxic to human respiratory systems, carcinogenic with sustained exposure and capable of contaminating soil, water, and food supplies in the affected area for months. Iran's health authorities told people to discard unsealed food, replace water filters, avoid outdoor air. This is the environmental reality of striking oil infrastructure in a populated area. And Iran has now declared that it will create the same environmental reality across the Gulf's energy infrastructure. The Gulf states don't just face missile damage to their oil facilities. They face the possibility of their air and cities with no natural water supply dependent entirely on energy-intensive desalination, with populations concentrated in dense urban centers, becoming what Tehran's air became after the American strikes. The human cost of that scenario doesn't register in military casualty statistics. It shows up in hospital admissions 6 months later, in cancer rates years later, in the quiet, undocumented suffering of populations who breathe poisoned air during a war that their governments never chose to fight. Europe is watching all of this from a position of remarkable vulnerability. Britain's gas reserves are depleting. Germany's industrial base is under energy cost pressure that is already forcing production decisions. The continent that imposed energy sanctions on Russia and pivoted to Gulf LNG as its salvation is now watching Gulf LNG disappear into the same conflict that eliminated its Russian alternative. There is no third option sitting in reserve. If this analysis gave you something the mainstream media didn't, share this video with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening right now. Let's ask the question that the 4-hour warning actually forces onto the table. What is the world prepared to do when $200 oil arrives? Not if, when. Because the storage clocks in Gulf-producing countries are not pausing for diplomatic negotiations. Iraq, 6 days of remaining oil storage capacity. Kuwait, 14 days. UAE and Qatar, 15 to 20 days. Saudi Arabia, roughly 60 days. But weeks of that buffer have already been consumed. When those tanks are full, production stops. When production stops, supply collapses. When supply collapses against unchanged global demand, the price doesn't negotiate its way to a reasonable number. It spikes fast, hard, in ways that make every projection made 3 weeks ago look conservative. Iran's message to America about $200 oil was not a number pulled from thin air. It was a calculated statement of what happens on the current trajectory, and an implicit question about whether American domestic political tolerance for that outcome is higher than Iranian tolerance for continued airstrikes. Iran's answer to its own question is clear. Iranian oil is subsidized domestically. Iranian civilians pay government-controlled prices regardless of what happens on international markets. Iran can sustain $200 global oil indefinitely from a domestic consumption standpoint. America cannot. American voters, already registering 90% opposition to this war, will not absorb gasoline at prices that follow $200 crude. American streets will not stay quiet when every grocery item doubles. American political institutions will not hold steady when the economic pain becomes visceral and universal. Iran is not threatening $200 oil as a military tactic. It's describing the arithmetic of a situation America created and cannot easily exit. Here's the deeper issue that this entire conflict has forced into visibility. The one that China identified early, and that the rest of the world is only now fully processing. Every war America has fought in the Middle East in the last 30 years has been premised on a specific assumption that American military technology creates an overwhelming, unchallengeable advantage that converts any confrontation into a manageable operation with predictable costs and a definable endpoint. That assumption has now been tested against a real adversary with real preparation, real technology, real institutional resilience, and real domestic cohesion. The assumption failed. Not failed in the sense that America lost every military exchange. The strikes on Iranian targets caused real damage. Failed in the strategic sense. The objective of the campaign was to produce Iranian collapse, Iranian capitulation, internal Iranian revolt. None of those things happened. Iran absorbed the damage, maintained its command structure, continued offensive operations, escalated its weapons tier from cheap drones to hypersonic missiles, and is now threatening to target every energy site in the Gulf simultaneously. The campaign did not achieve its objectives, and the cost of that failure is not being paid by the people who made the decisions. It's being paid by workers in Dubai who lost their jobs, by Pakistani laborers who couldn't get flights home, by European families facing energy bills that are rewriting their household economics, by Iranian civilians breathing toxic air, by Israeli citizens whose government can no longer guarantee missile warnings will arrive before the missiles do. The Russia dimension deserves one final moment of clear analysis. Russia is the country that 2 years ago invaded Ukraine and was sanctioned into international isolation by a united Western coalition. Today, Russia is watching Western military credibility destroyed in the Gulf. Western energy security shattered by the simultaneous loss of Russian and Gulf supply. European governments that led the sanctions campaign now quietly asking Russia to mediate a conflict those same governments helped cause through their unconditional support for the policies that sparked it. Russia didn't need to win in Ukraine to win strategically. It needed to wait for America to overextend somewhere else. America provided that somewhere else. And now Russia is the country that Europe needs for gas, that Gulf states need for diplomatic cover in Moscow, and that no one can afford to alienate further. The 4-hour warning Iran issued this week is the sharpest possible summary of where this conflict has arrived. 9 days. That's how long this war has been running. In 9 days, America's regional defense architecture has been severely damaged. Gulf investment is withdrawing from American markets. Oil is heading toward prices the global economy cannot sustain. Toxic air is over Tehran. Water infrastructure is under threat. Oman is condemning the war publicly. Russia is blocking the diplomatic path. Europe is in energy crisis. And Iran says the real attack, the one targeting every energy site in the region simultaneously, hasn't happened yet. The 4 hours passed. The markets opened. The oil price moved. And the world that existed before this war, the one where American military presence was assumed to be stabilizing, where Gulf cities were the world's safest, where energy prices were a policy variable rather than a countdown clock. That world is not coming back. What comes next depends on a decision that has been available since day one. The same decision that gets harder and more expensive to make with every passing hour, and easier to understand the necessity of with every barrel that ticks toward $200. I'm Marcus. If you made it to the end of this video, you already understand more about what is really happening than most people watching the news right now. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to see it, and drop a comment below. Because the decisions being made in the next 48 hours will affect every person on this planet for the next 40 years.